Across the breadth of the known galaxy, entire civilizations traded, warred, and evolved under the unshakable belief that humanity was nothing more than an old fable. The very word carried the same weight as dragons or spirits, figures woven into folklore to teach lessons, not to be studied as fact. Yet their legend persisted with unusual stubbornness. Among the archives of the Zelleran, there were passages describing a people who spoke in fire and shaped metal as if it were clay. The reptilian Darak remembered tales from their nesting elders about pale wanderers who crossed voids without fear, leaving behind ruins that no one could decipher. Even the stoic Quarren, a species renowned for scorning superstition, muttered in hushed tones of battles long past where humans fought until even their enemies wept at the relentlessness. Despite the diversity of cultures, the stories all carried the same undertone: humanity was dangerous, unpredictable, and unforgettable. For millennia, the consensus hardened. Scholars dismissed the legends as cultural artifacts, shared hallucinations of pre-spacefaring civilizations trying to make sense of unexplained ruins or anomalies. Academies prided themselves on erasing the human question from serious curricula. Younglings might whisper about them after lessons ended, but only in the way children on primitive worlds once whispered about monsters hiding under beds. It was harmless entertainment, nothing more. When explorers mapped uncharted systems, finding derelict structures carved with untranslatable markings, the official response was always the same: natural phenomena, coincidences, perhaps remnants of a forgotten minor species that had since perished. To attach the label, human, was to invite ridicule. Yet denial had its cracks. On isolated stations, smugglers sometimes displayed artifacts with impossible craftsmanship. Blades that never dulled, armor that weighed nothing yet resisted disintegration beams, fragments of starship hulls that defied analysis. The objects were swiftly confiscated, hidden in sealed vaults, and their owners silenced by authorities who insisted such discoveries endangered social stability. The truth was less noble. The artifacts unsettled even the most logical minds. How could something not real leave behind matter that science itself struggled to dissect? Each time the question surfaced, officials buried it deeper, hoping time would wash away the discomfort. Ordinary people kept the myths alive in quieter ways. Story singers turned the legends into epics, where humans appeared as cunning tricksters who defeated arrogant emperors. Traders told one another of secret star systems guarded by shadows, warning that trespassers vanished without a trace. The myths varied, sometimes painting humans as saviors, other times as monsters, but always as a species beyond measure. The very contradictions strengthened the impression that these were nothing more than exaggerated fantasies, warped by centuries of retelling. But to the perceptive, the contradictions suggested something more dangerous: the kind of distortion that occurs only when the original truth is too overwhelming to capture cleanly. Among a scattered few, obsession replaced skepticism. Independent scholars, often ridiculed by their peers, dedicated lifetimes to following faint trails. They combed forgotten libraries, hunted for anomalies in ancient star maps, and compared fragments of oral tradition across species. Most died with little more than notebooks filled with unanswered questions. Yet their work carried a pattern too consistent to ignore. The myths always placed humans at the edge of great upheavals, as if their presence marked turning points in galactic history. Whether as warriors, explorers, or rebels, they never lingered in the background. They were always decisive, always remembered, always vanishing before the dust settled. The wider galaxy, caught up in commerce and diplomacy, preferred to laugh at such notions. After all, the modern empires stood secure in their dominance. Fleets spanned thousands of light years, technologies cracked energy from stars, and biological sciences prolonged life to centuries. What relevance could mythical humans hold in an age so advanced? Arrogance made it convenient to treat the stories as primitive entertainment. When power feels eternal, myths are easily dismissed. Still, unease lingered. In remote colonies, miners spoke of structures buried deep under rock that predated known settlement. Scouting crews sometimes reported fleeting sensor contacts, ships that appeared, observed, and vanished before pursuit could lock on. Officials dismissed them as instrument malfunctions, yet the crews swore the sightings were real. Conspiracies flourished, claiming that humans had never disappeared, only chosen to remain hidden, watching silently until some unknown condition was met. By the current age, the contradiction had reached its peak. On one hand, the galaxy believed the question settled: humans never existed, or if they had, they were long extinct. On the other, the persistence of the stories across so many species hinted at something far deeper than random invention. Legends fade when they lack roots, but these refused to die. Even the youngest children knew the name, though none could explain why it clung to every culture like a shadow. The whispers carried a paradoxical mix of fear and longing. Fear, because every tale emphasized humanity's relentlessness, their refusal to bow even when annihilation loomed. Longing, because in those same tales, humans were the ones who inspired others to stand when surrender seemed the only choice. The galaxy laughed outwardly, but secretly, many wondered, what if the myths were true? What if somewhere, hidden beyond the charted stars, the humans still endured, waiting for the moment the galaxy most needed them? The myths, dismissed for centuries, carried an unsettling implication. If they were only stories, then nothing more needed to be said. But if even a fraction held truth, then the galaxy's arrogance in discarding them might one day exact a price. And though no one could say it aloud without ridicule, the thought crept unbidden into countless minds: perhaps the day would come when the question of humanity would not be academic. Perhaps the legends had survived not because they entertained, but because deep down, they carried warning. The galaxy prided itself on equilibrium, but that balance was never more fragile than in the age when the great coalitions began to fracture. Dozens of species had carved empires from the stars, each boasting fleets and technologies that seemed unchallengeable within their borders. Trade networks pulsed with wealth, while councils and treaties maintained the veneer of peace. Yet beneath the surface, rivalries sharpened like hidden blades. The warning signs appeared slowly at first: minor conflicts along trade lanes, raiders striking colonies, whispers of resource shortages in sectors long thought stable. Few realized these were not isolated disruptions but precursors to something far greater. The true storm arrived with the emergence of a predatory force whose ambition dwarfed the petty rivalries of established powers. Whether one labeled them marauders, dominators, or simply conquerors, their strategy was unmistakable. They struck border systems with ferocity, dismantled defenses, and assimilated or annihilated entire populations without pause. At first, neighboring powers assumed the aggressors could be contained. After all, every empire claimed fleets larger than anything seen before. But as campaigns dragged on, one unsettling truth became undeniable: the coalition forces were being dismantled with alarming speed. This enemy did not negotiate. Diplomats vanished without response, supply lines were cut with precision, and every defensive strategy collapsed under relentless assault. Star systems that had stood for centuries as unshakable strongholds fell in weeks. Refugees poured into central territories, carrying stories of devastation that were so consistent they chilled even the most skeptical ears. Entire archives burned, populations enslaved, and infrastructures disassembled piece by piece, leaving nothing behind but silence. For all their technological sophistication, the galaxy's civilizations realized they were hopelessly outmatched in both tactics and will. Panic spread through the governing councils. Emergency sessions devolved into shouting matches, with factions accusing one another of weakness or betrayal. Promises of mutual defense cracked as fear took precedence over cooperation. Some powers withdrew their fleets to protect only their home systems, abandoning allies in the process. Others threw everything they had into desperate offensives, only to watch their forces crushed in detail. Each defeat carried a heavier toll, not just in ships and lives, but in the psychological foundation of civilizations that had once believed themselves untouchable. In their desperation, leaders turned to the deepest recesses of their archives, searching for forgotten weapons or strategies that might level the playing field. What they uncovered were not blueprints or technologies, but myths. Across cultures, records of humans surfaced once more. What had once been dismissed as cultural detritus suddenly took on a darker relevance. Stories described warriors who refused to yield even when empires collapsed around them, strategists who turned weakness into decisive advantage, and wanderers who shaped the course of wars before vanishing without trace. No matter the culture, the message was the same: when hopelessness reigned, humans appeared, and history changed. For many, the suggestion that these myths might hold value was laughable. Generals scoffed at the idea of chasing fairy tales when their fleets were already burning. Yet a minority clung to the thought with increasing conviction. If the myths persisted across countless species separated by time and distance, perhaps they were more than fiction. A few dared to voice the unthinkable. What if humanity had not vanished, but chosen silence until a moment like this? Such speculation was met with ridicule, but the words could not be entirely ignored. With each defeat, the impossible seemed a little less absurd. Rumors began to spread among common citizens as well. Refugees spoke of encounters on the edges of collapsing sectors, ships that did not match any known registry, appearing briefly before disappearing again. Military outposts reported sensor anomalies, fleeting contacts that resembled no craft in coalition databases. Official explanations blamed malfunctions or psychological stress, yet the pattern grew too consistent to dismiss. Whispered conversations in taverns and marketplaces began to connect the dots, reviving the oldest legends with renewed urgency. If anyone could stand against the rising tide, perhaps it was the ones long believed to be only myth. The paradox deepened. To dismiss the legends outright seemed reckless when survival itself hung in the balance. Yet to act on them risked ridicule, wasted resources, and the loss of what little trust remained among the fractured powers. Some leaders argued it was better to die with dignity than chase ghosts. Others insisted that even the faintest chance must be pursued, for extinction left no room for pride. As more systems fell, the argument tipped steadily toward desperation. Scouts were dispatched into uncharted territories once linked to human folklore, their missions cloaked in secrecy to avoid accusations of folly. The galaxy stood at a precipice. Confidence had eroded, unity lay in ruins, and the enemy's advance showed no sign of slowing. All that remained was the gnawing uncertainty that perhaps the myths, long mocked as childish tales, carried a truth waiting to resurface. If the humans had ever existed, the galaxy needed them now more than ever. The alternative was unthinkable, a future where no species remained to even remember the stories. The search that began in whispers soon became a gamble of survival. A coalition of desperate powers assembled a final expedition, not to challenge the enemy directly but to chase a possibility most still mocked. The fleet moved beyond established star charts, into territories so rarely traversed that even automated probes had avoided them. Their orders were vague: find evidence of the forgotten ones, or return with confirmation that the myths were truly empty. Many aboard considered the mission little more than exile, a convenient way to rid the councils of dissenters clinging to fairy tales. Yet beneath the cynicism burned a spark of hope that none dared speak aloud. For weeks, they found nothing but void. Then anomalies began to surface. Sensor readings revealed energy signatures too precise to be natural, yet entirely absent from coalition databases. Probes sent to investigate vanished, leaving only fragmented telemetry suggesting interception by unknown vessels. Patrols reported glimpses of structures built into asteroids, hollowed fortresses whose design bore no resemblance to known engineering traditions. The evidence mounted until denial became impossible. Someone was out here, operating with intention, and whoever they were had mastered the art of remaining unseen. The first encounter occurred without ceremony. Coalition ships emerged from a jump corridor to find themselves shadowed by craft unlike anything in their records. Sleek hulls scarred by centuries of wear, lines sharp and purposeful, weapons arrays understated but menacing. The vessels did not announce themselves. They merely watched, closing in with an unnerving silence, as if weighing the newcomers before choosing whether to strike. When transmissions were attempted, the coalition commanders expected no reply. Instead, a voice returned, clear, steady, unmistakably human. The words were simple. "You were not meant to find us. But we heard your need." Shock spread through the expedition crews. The legends spoke of warriors, wanderers, ghosts, but never of such direct acknowledgement. The figures that stepped into communication channels bore the features described only in stories: eyes sharp and direct, expressions carrying a mixture of endurance and quiet authority. They were not giants, nor monsters, nor ethereal beings. They were recognizably mortal, yet every detail radiated a presence that made the watching aliens hesitate to breathe. The humans carried themselves like those accustomed to hardship, every movement stripped of excess, every word chosen with deliberate weight. The explanations they offered were fragmented, but enough to shape a picture that matched no prior assumption. Humanity had not vanished through extinction but by choice. Long ago, after wars that scarred entire regions of space, they had withdrawn, sealing themselves from the galaxy. Their reasoning was survival, not cowardice. To remain would have meant annihilation, and so they chose to let the galaxy forget while they rebuilt in silence. For generations they prepared, watching through hidden channels, their fleets sharpening while the rest of the galaxy laughed at their supposed non-existence. Reaction among the coalition officers varied between awe and fear. To some, the confirmation felt like salvation: the myths had been true, and perhaps hope had returned. To others, it was a chilling revelation. If humans could hide for so long, what else were they capable of? What motives truly guided them now? The question lingered as the humans made their stance clear: they had no desire to dominate councils or demand tribute. They had endured too much loss to chase power. What they sought instead was to turn the tide of the war threatening all, because unchecked destruction would eventually reach even the hidden bastions they had built. The decision of whether to trust them was never truly in the coalition's hands. Humans revealed strength not by boasting but by demonstration. In coordinated maneuvers, they displayed tactics beyond anything the expedition had witnessed. Warships moving as if sharing a single mind, strike groups forming and dispersing with flawless precision, weaponry both ancient in appearance and devastating in effect. Every action conveyed that they were not merely survivors but veterans of conflicts so severe the current crisis seemed almost familiar. When the first agreements were struck, they carried none of the pomp of diplomacy. Humans offered terms with blunt clarity: cooperation on the battlefield, strategic coordination, and shared intelligence. They demanded no oaths, no worship, no kneeling. They needed allies, not followers. The coalition officers, humbled by both desperation and awe, accepted without hesitation. And in that moment, the myth solidified into reality. Humanity had returned, not as whispered figures of bedtime tales, but as a fleet forged in silence, emerging at last to face the enemy the galaxy could not defeat alone. The first moment humanity entered the war was unlike anything the coalition had witnessed. For months, battle reports had followed a grimly predictable pattern: fleets crushed in open space, defenses overrun, enemy advances unbroken. But when the human armada arrived, everything shifted. Their ships did not resemble the massive, ornate dreadnoughts of the established empires. They were lean, functional, and scarred, the kind of vessels that spoke of endless campaigns fought not for pride but for survival. Yet once they engaged, it became clear these were not relics of a forgotten people. They were instruments honed to perfection. The opening salvos revealed the first shock. Coalition fleets had long relied on overwhelming numbers, dense formations, and heavy firepower. The humans approached differently. Their warships dispersed into fluid patterns, each vessel acting with autonomy yet moving in flawless coordination. Where the enemy expected predictable responses, the humans feigned retreat, then pivoted into ambushes with surgical precision. Entire enemy wings found themselves corralled and destroyed before they understood the trap. This was not just technology at work, it was instinct, sharpened through generations of adaptation. Weapons fire illuminated the void, but even here humanity defied expectation. Their armaments appeared outdated, simple rail cannons and missile systems compared to the energy lances and quantum disruptors favored by the galaxy. Yet the results spoke louder than appearances. Human weapons struck with devastating accuracy, bypassing shielding configurations the coalition had never managed to penetrate. Their projectiles shattered hulls that had endured countless barrages before. Later analysis revealed why. Every round carried layers of engineering meant to exploit weaknesses no one else had even noticed. The simplicity was an illusion. In reality, the weapons embodied centuries of hard-earned knowledge. More startling than their firepower was the way they fought at close range. Where most commanders feared proximity, humans embraced it. Boarding craft cut through chaos with terrifying efficiency, ramming directly into enemy cruisers and disgorging soldiers who moved like shadows. Enemy troops, trained to expect orderly engagements, collapsed under the relentless pace of human assault. Those who survived described combatants who never seemed to tire, whose discipline turned every corridor into a death trap. They were not reckless berserkers. They were methodical, precise, and utterly unwilling to concede ground. Allied forces watching from the periphery struggled to comprehend what they saw. They had been told humans were myth, that stories of their tenacity were embellishments. Yet now those tales unfolded before them in reality, and even the most exaggerated legends felt muted compared to the truth. Commanders who had resigned themselves to defeat suddenly felt a stirring they had long buried, the belief that victory was possible. The psychological shift spread faster than any weapon. Soldiers who had expected annihilation now cheered as human squadrons carved through enemy formations, proving the invincible could bleed. The enemy, for their part, faltered in ways they never had before. They had crushed every resistance with ease, but the arrival of an opponent they could not predict broke their momentum. Standard strategies failed, counterattacks collapsed, and panic began to ripple through their ranks. For the first time in the campaign, they retreated in disarray. The coalition, stunned by the reversal, rallied under human direction. Defensive lines stabilized, refugee worlds were spared, and hope returned to territories that had resigned themselves to ruin. News of the victory spread like wildfire. Recordings of human maneuvers circulated across the galaxy, igniting awe and disbelief in equal measure. Civilians whispered prayers of gratitude to names once spoken only as legend. Scholars scrambled to revise archives, forced to accept that the myths had been warnings, not fantasies. Leaders who had mocked the idea of humanity found themselves begging for contact, eager to pledge allegiance before their people demanded it. The myth had transformed into a force reshaping the entire balance of power. The humans themselves offered no speeches, no proclamations of superiority. When asked how they had achieved such feats, their leaders answered only with calm pragmatism. Survival had been their teacher, war their companion, and patience their weapon. They had not come to rule, but to ensure the galaxy did not fall into silence. Their presence was both promise and warning. The legends were true, and now they were written in fire across the stars. What began as myth had become undeniable reality, and in the aftermath of that first battle, every species understood that the war would never be the same again. The aftermath of humanity's arrival reshaped the galaxy more profoundly than any single victory. Where despair had dominated, there now spread an unshakable conviction that survival was possible. Entire civilizations that had braced for extinction began to believe again, not because their own strength had grown, but because they had witnessed a power long thought impossible, humans returning from myth to reality. The shock of their existence became as important as the battles themselves, for the very knowledge that they were real shattered the inevitability of defeat. Coalition leaders scrambled to adapt. Councils that once mocked the idea of chasing legends now rushed to send envoys to human commanders, eager to establish formal ties. What surprised them most was the restraint with which the humans conducted themselves. They demanded no oaths of servitude, no tributes, no monuments to glorify their return. Instead, they requested coordination, intelligence sharing, and mutual defense. Their tone was blunt, their expectations clear. Victory required unity, and unity would not tolerate the arrogance that had fractured the galaxy in the first place. Many found the approach disarming. The species that had the most right to dictate terms instead set boundaries rooted in pragmatism, as though humanity's only goal was to ensure that no one repeated the mistakes that once forced them into exile. Among ordinary citizens, reverence grew at a speed that astonished even human observers. Songs and stories emerged overnight, retelling ancient myths now confirmed as truth. Children played at being human warriors, imitating the relentless courage described by those who had fought alongside them. Refugees whispered thanks to unseen allies, invoking humanity's name as if it carried protective power. For countless beings, the humans were more than allies. They were living proof that hope could survive centuries of silence. Even cultures that once ridiculed the legends began weaving them into their identity, eager to be connected to the return of the most improbable of allies. For the enemy, the psychological blow was devastating. They had thrived on inevitability, on the certainty that resistance collapsed as swiftly as it rose. That certainty was gone. Every new engagement carried hesitation, the awareness that somewhere within the chaos, human fleets might strike. The myth that once comforted the oppressed now haunted the oppressors, a shadow in every strategy meeting, a ghost in every retreat order. The once unstoppable advance slowed, then fractured, under the weight of a foe they could not measure or predict. The coalition itself was not unchanged. Old rivalries began to fade under the necessity of survival. Species that had distrusted one another for generations found themselves cooperating under human-led strategies. Joint commands replaced fragmented defenses, and resources once hoarded jealously were redistributed according to need. It was not harmony born of idealism but of necessity enforced by human clarity. Either they fought as one, or they would fall separately. Slowly, the galaxy realized that the humans were not only warriors but catalysts for unity, turning fragmented coalitions into something closer to a single fighting force. Political consequences rippled outward. Empires that had once dismissed lesser species now saw those same species elevated by their cooperation with humanity. New voices emerged in councils, empowered by the credibility that came with standing beside the myths returned. Old elites lost influence, replaced by leaders who embraced adaptation over tradition. In this way, humanity reshaped not only the battlefield but the very structure of galactic power. Yet for all their growing influence, the humans never shed their enigmatic aura. They spoke rarely of their centuries in hiding, offering only hints of the wars and struggles that forged them. When asked why they chose to reveal themselves now, their response carried the same quiet weight as their actions. The galaxy had reached a breaking point, and silence was no longer survival but complicity. They had waited not out of indifference, but because their return would mean nothing unless the moment demanded it absolutely. The final lesson was one that resonated far beyond the battlefield. Humanity had once been dismissed as a bedtime story, a collective dream no one truly believed. Yet when they stepped from legend into reality, they proved that myths endure not by accident but because they carry truths too powerful to die. Now every star system, every council, every citizen understood that humans were not an echo of the past but a force reshaping the present. The galaxy would never again laugh at their name. They had returned, and in their return, they had reminded all species of a truth once forgotten. When darkness rises, humanity does not vanish, it arrives.